Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe, and I hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. If you are tuning in live here on Behance, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. We've got Wade and Mwenda and Nabil, Drew, Asun, and Laura. Great to see all of you. Hope you're excited for the weekend. And of course, another XD Masterclass number 99. We are almost at 100. You know, I'm very tempted to just cancel all the Masterclasses right now so we never hit 100. I don't know why. That would be incredibly irresponsible of me, but it's tempting. All right, let's go ahead and hop over my screen. We're gonna get going with Masterclass number 99. Now, for 100, which is next Friday, I think I know what we're gonna start to cover. But if anyone has last minute suggestions that may change my mind, tweet it at Pinsky. It'll be a lot of fun. All right, so if you've been following me on Twitter or Instagram or Dribbble or Behance or any of the platforms that I'm on, I think even LinkedIn I've been posting, you might know that during the month of July, I have been releasing an XD file every single day. I hope I can make it to the end of July 31st, but every day I've been releasing an XD file, and it all started down here. So head on over to Dribbble, dribbble.com/Pinsky, or I post some on Instagram, some on Behance, some on Twitter. And here's the first one that I released on July 1st. It's a sidebar element, component. It animates beautifully. It's got nested components for hover states inside of it. It's kind of fun. But some of you wanted to know how this particular element was created. So I figured, what better time to show you all how to do this than a masterclass? And if you want to take a peek at all the other ones that I have been releasing, I have things from, video players to file upload interactions. Some of them are probably never going to be useful for some of you, like the minion, right? But I know a lot of you wanted to see how that was done, and also the Game Boy as well. I did upload this, so you can go ahead and poke around. Now, some of these are definitely for educational purposes only, for hopefully obvious reasons, but some of them you can definitely download, like the tables, which I uploaded yesterday. Download those and, use it in your projects if you want to. Poke around, see how it was created. There's, hover effects and all sorts of fun things, and maybe I'll cover this as well in a future masterclass. All right. Let's go ahead and hop over to Adobe XD. Boop, here we go. And we're gonna get going. Now, for this particular element, this sidebar navigation, there's really no right size. It really comes down to what you're designing it for. Now, in this case, we're probably gonna be designing it for a web experience, but it could also be for tablet, it could be for all sorts of different things, right? So let's go, maybe we'll do web 1366. Usually we do 1920, maybe we'll do a little bit smaller today, right? And we have our first artboard. Now, again, a lot of it depends on what you're designing it for. Could be a dark experience, could be a light experience, could be somewhere in between, right? Now, for this particular, we're gonna start with the light experience, and I'm gonna shift the background color a little bit because the navigation bar itself is going to be basically pure white. So I'm gonna shift the color of the artboard and just add a little bit of blue in there. Thank you, Wade, for posting those links to my socials. I definitely try to keep up to date on social as much as I also try to avoid it as much as I can for obvious reasons. But, I'll post my work on there from time to time, especially the freebies. All right, so let's go ahead and get going. We're going to start by actually designing the expanded view because we're going to be, even though the navigation bar is going to be starting off collapsed, right? We want to make sure we have everything designed, from the icons to the text to, everything that's going to be displayed in the expanded view. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool, shortcut key R, and drag it out. Let's start, I'm just going to place it in the center just so I can see it nice and easily. And I'm not too concerned about the width of this navigation bar at the moment because that will change based on what we have inside of it, right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a few styles very quickly. I'm going to, round out the corners, and let's go about 16 looks pretty good. I wouldn't go much more than that. You know, I probably wouldn't go 24, definitely wouldn't go to 32 if you're following that 8 pixel grid. I would stay around maybe 8. 8's not too bad. You know, it's very subtle, and we're going to deal with the accessibility contrast issues in just a moment. 8's not bad, but I'm thinking maybe 16. You can probably also do something like 12 if you find that 16 and 8 are kind of just not working, right? It's fine for these elements to kind of break from that 8 pixel grid. And then behind it, we're going to apply maybe a drop shadow. Now, drop shadows are very tricky. If you've been watching my masterclasses, which I know many of you have been, you know I'm a stickler for drop shadows. You know, you don't want to do this. That's just, PowerPoint or Microsoft Word in 1990, those basic default drop shadows. Yes, it does the job, right? It separates this white container from this light background, but it doesn't have to be this way, right? It just doesn't. So what we're going to do is we're going to, shift the color a little bit. You know, most designers, especially when they're starting off, they'll just do a solid black shadow, which in some cases it works. But in this case, we're going to add a little bit of blue in there. A little bit of blue, right? Doesn't really look much different yet. So we want to make a few changes. We're going to drop the opacity quite a bit. In this case, let's start around 24. We might have to dial that back even more. And then one of the most important things you'll want to do for your drop shadows in some situations is bring down or separate it from the element and then blur it, right? Again, it depends, right? So sometimes you'll want to blur it, sometimes not so much. Get in there, right? And it's a lot of trial and error, right? So let's bring it down to about 16. Maybe we'll blur it a bit more to 24. And we're starting to see something, right? We still more or less get to that same result of separating this container from the background. I would argue maybe we can, add maybe a very subtle border, possibly change the background color. There's a few different things that we can do, but it still kind of gets us there, right? And we'll definitely tweak this as we go. But what I want to do now is spend a little bit of time creating the elements inside of this navigation bar. And again, there's going to be 2 views, collapse and expand. Now, at the top, we might want an icon, which is going to look a little bit different in both views. So I'm going to hop over to my document assets. I'm going to hop into my boop branding library. And I have here a few icons that I've designed for the new Boop brand, which I've been using in a lot of the different UI kits that I've been releasing. And we'll do maybe the long one. Drag this in. And it's very large. I'll make it quite a bit smaller. We obviously don't want it white, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to shift the color, again, adding a little bit of blue in there. And I'm going to make it smaller. Now, some of you might be noticing that when I dragged this element into XD, it came over with a link icon. And that's because this element, even though it was designed in Adobe XD, I published the library. So it remains linked to that source library, which is great because if I'm updating the Boop branding assets at some point in the future, or design system, if I had additional elements like colors and character styles, I just have to update it once. And then I can choose whether to update it, in this document or any other document that contains these elements and components, right? But of course, if I wanted to break that link, I can right click and unlink component. And that will give me access to all the goodies, including the layers inside of it, right? Which in this case will be important. That's not too bad for the size. I might drop it down a little bit more. I don't want the logo too large at the top. And I'll place it somewhere in this area here. Now right now it's about 23 from the left, terrible number. So, 24. Not too concerned about the one at the top, but I'm going to drop it just a little bit. 23.9, wonderful, right? Now, of course, that's because the sizing and the values are a little bit off. So let me just do that, and there we go. All right, so now I'm thinking in the initial view, in that collapsed view, I may not want to see the entire Boop logo. And in fact, it may not fit. So what I'm thinking is I'm going to grab the O, or I guess the O's, because there are several O's in this one, never mind. And then the P, and I'm just going to shove it on over. Now, right now, it looks a bit strange, but it all makes sense once we start collapsing this and use an object mask to hide the areas and the elements that we don't want to see, right? All right, so we've got our logo looking okay. Again, looks a bit strange. But what we want now is we want to add our links down below. And this could be home, dashboard, search, notification, appointments, so on and so forth. So to start, the first one is we want to start looking for icons that will suit the home experience, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to start by taking a peek into our plugins. So if I hop over to our plugins, which is right down at the bottom left-hand corner, that Lego looking thing. And I do have the Icons for Design plugin installed. Now, if you don't have plugins, definitely press the plus button at the top, or if you have no plugins, there's a big blue button, I believe, up there. Press that, you can search Icons for Design, and you'll be brought to this experience here, where I can type in something like home, or sometimes house. Nope, probably home. We've got some decent icons here. So again, if you don't have icons at your disposal, the Icons for Design plugin is a great place to start. They're all open source, so you can use them in your projects. Or if you do have if you do have icons of your own, I do have some in Nucleo, which is a third-party icon manager. I can look up something like home, and let's see. I have the problem when you're an icon hoarder like myself is you just have so many icons and options to choose from. It gets a little bit overwhelming sometimes. But this icon here, which is from the Coco set, I believe I purchased this on UI8.net. .net or .com? I don't remember. Wade will probably correct me on that. But this icon here looks kind of nice. So I'm going to copy it and paste it in here. And in terms of the size, that's not too bad. I think that could potentially work. And, you know, depending on the icon, some are border-based icons, some are fill-based. This one in particular is fill-based. So I don't have as much flexibility to actually change the border or the thickness. Of course, I can add a border on top of it, which, you know, could help in some situations. But many of the icons that you'll find in the Icons for Design plugin, like this one here, is a border-based icon. So you can make this as thin or as thick as you want, right? Which is always helpful. Rob is laughing at the icon hoarder. Trust me, Rob, icons and fonts. Now, thankfully, you know, Adobe fonts exist, so I don't have to pay for any of the fonts. Sometimes I do pay for some premium fonts that are, you know, off of Adobe fonts, but icons I spend probably way too much money. All right, so we've got our little home icon looking pretty fancy. Now, to the right, we're gonna want some text that says home, right? Home, beautiful, looks great, right? Well, sort of, not really. Right now we have Helvetica, and we have this weird looking gray color, which we probably don't want. Someone saying this is my first live masterclass to attend. Thank you, appreciate you attending. Hope you stick around for next week, masterclass to 100. Hope you stick around. All right, so we've got our text layer, right? But we want to change up the typeface a little bit. Helvetica, not terrible, but I want to get something a little bit cleaner, a little bit maybe more stylistic, which kind of goes against you. Cleaner, more stylistic, I don't know. Anyways, one typeface that I've used quite a bit is, thank you, Wade, UI8.net, thank you, is Brandon Grotesque, which is a typeface from Adobe Fonts. So if I hop over to Safari, go over to Adobe Fonts, that's stock, and here we go, and I type in Brandon. Oh, there it is. Brandon Grotesque. It's a fun typeface, got a, you know, some nice elements to it. But of course, if you want to just browse what's available, if you go to all fonts on Adobe Fonts, and you have a bunch of different tags over here to the left. Clean, geometric. For something like this, I probably stay away from something like funky or luxurious, but you know, clean will get you some pretty decent ones. The Forma family, I've been using a lot in some of my UI kits. It's a very nice typeface. Definitely check that one. All right. So we've got home, and I might want to make sure that our colors are very consistent. So up here, you might remember that I chose this, you know, dark blue, which I'm going to make sure to add to my document assets. right over here. And now I can use this color basically on all my elements, including the text, right? Now, that's looking a little bit too large and probably a little bit too thin. So I'm going to bump up the weight of this text link to bold, and then I might want to bring down the size. Bold is medium, maybe. Medium might work a little bit better, right? Now, a lot of this is trial and error, right? We have 24 for the size of the icon, including the bounds around it. Might want to go smaller, might want to go larger, but you don't want to push it too much. You want to kind of find that sweet spot, which sometimes is a bit difficult to do, right? So I'm going to go ahead and place this. Let's try about 16 from the... It's not too bad. Might want to bring it in a little bit. We'll see how that looks. All right, so we have one of our links. Now again, we're going to move this over to the right for the initial view. We may actually work backwards. So we may create the component as the expanded view and then create the hover state as the collapsed view. It's going to be a bit backwards, but it's going to work. All right, so next what we want is we're going to make sure to group these elements. So I'm going to hold down my Shift key and click, and then group, Command or Control G, and I'll call this home. Now to make our life a little bit easier, we can start using stack, and that'll allow us to very easily create additional links down below, but also it'll allow us to rearrange these elements very easily. So I'm going to place this group into a larger group, Command and Control G, and I'll just call this links. And then over within the properties inspector, I'm going to turn a stack on. Now, because there's only one object, in this case it's a single group, inside of this larger group, it defined the stack as a horizontal stack, which is the default if there's only one element inside of it. If there were multiple, it would determine which direction they're going. In this case, I do want them to go vertical, so I'm going to switch that over like that. Don't have to worry about the padding at this point. And now what I can do is I can dive in here, select this group. Whoops. I missed it. And then duplicate, right? So I can just continue to duplicate all the way down as I need to. Let's do one at a time. So this one's going to be probably dashboard. And then I'm going to want an icon to go right over here. I'm also going to, let's move this over a little bit, just so we're kind of close to the edge where it's going to land. And I'm going to drag out some guide just so, to make sure that everything lines up really nicely. And if I hop back over to Nucleo and look up something like, sometimes it's menu, sometimes it's grid. There's all different ways you can, of course, an icon like this, you can very easily create with a few rectangles. This one here is from Font Awesome. Now these icons are very large. I think they're 512 by 512 by default when you bring them on in. So we might see a little bit of strange movement going on, right? Now, I believe these are also border-based, which is great. Ooh, those are large. See? Actually, these ones are not. These are not border-based, which is fine. All right, that size looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my home icon. All right, we've got our dashboard. Now, the spacing obviously is way too squishy up here. We're going to deal with that shortly, but we're going to go ahead and dashboard, duplicate, and we're going to do our next one, which is going to be search. There we go, and search. Simple icon, right? Now, I know a lot of designers have opinions on this, and some of you might be looking at this and cringing really heavily that I've used one icon from Coco, another icon from Font Awesome, and another icon, this one is coming from Omni. Some people like to keep it very consistent, which totally makes sense because, in many cases the border weights are consistent and all that fun stuff is consistent, which, definitely that makes a lot of sense. But in some cases, it may work if you need something very specific. That icon looks a little bit too large, even though it kind of, lines up, looks a little bit large. All right. I'm going to move this up a little bit as well. Stretch that on out. All right, that's getting there, right? We're getting there. search, and we're going to duplicate. And this next one is going to be notifications. Someone's asking, the Boop logo looks so amazing. Have you made it in Adobe XD or the magic of Illustrator? So that one was made strictly in Adobe XD. I do have the file somewhere, but just to kind of show you what it, whoops, wrong file, where did it go? Yeah, so if I dive in here and bring this on back, there it is there, right? And I have a shorter version, so it doesn't look as long as this one, but yeah, totally Adobe XD. And you can tell here the O's are actually made of a Boolean object. And there's just, you know, these slashes in here to kind of separate the different O's. I was trying to be a little bit clever. I don't know if I succeeded or not, but you know, it looks pretty good. All right, so we have notifications, and then we're gonna want, our bell icon. So hopping over to Nucleo one more time, we can look up bell. Sometimes it'll be under notification. This one looks pretty good from Font Awesome. Ooh, this one's kind of fun. This is from Core. Do I want to go for another font icon library? I'm gonna have people just like unsubscribing and tweeting me just terrible things. Not really. I hope not. Let's stick with Cocoa. Pop that in there. Make it a little bit larger. I think that might be too large. Yeah, I think these are a little bit too large overall. I'm going to just drop that size a touch. In a moment, we're going to get to the active and inactive links as well. All right, so we have our notifications. And then I'm going to duplicate, and we might want something like appointments. And then for this one, Kasuna is saying, I really love phosphor icons. If you're tuning in live, I would love to know what icon libraries that you all use on a daily basis. Is it Feather, Font Awesome, Core, Omni? There's just so many different libraries out there. Some are open source, some are premium. Definitely let me know in the chat. I would love to take a peek at some of them. So we've got our calendar. This one is from Omni. It's not too bad. It might be a little bit too busy, but let's go ahead and bring this in and we'll take a look. This one from Core is kind of nice. It's, you know, kind of fits the overall design where it's a little bit rounded. But let's see what this one looks like. Shrink that on down. And I mean, it's not too bad. So there's that option, and then there's the option that I was looking at from Core. I'm sure Cocoa also has a pretty decent option as well. That's probably very similar to this one. Then there's this one here. So there's this option here, right? And then there is this one. I'm thinking that the Core icon, just because it's a little bit curvier, it kind of fits, especially with the notification icon. I think I'm going to stick with that for now. And we'll see. All right. And then we might want maybe something like bookmarks. And this one's from Unicon, which is another icon library. I'm just breaking all sorts of rules today, aren't I? That's the fun of... Are you seeing it? I'm very amused right now. Are you all seeing it? I hope you're seeing it. Oh, it's a border based. I'm incredibly... Anyways, enough, Howard. Sometimes you just have to pause and see a face in your icon. Anyways, Eric is saying Streamline, Awesome, and Feather are his top 3. That's a pretty good set of libraries over there. All right, so we've got our bookmarks. I'm going to duplicate that, and maybe we'll do settings. And then after this one, we're going to move on, and we're going to cover some of the other elements. And then we'll maybe come back to adding additional links if we need to. So for this one, let's try settings. I know sometimes you'll want to type in gear. We'll also bring you some different results. But this one here looks pretty fancy. Oh, the noun project, Craig says. Yeah, that's a good one as well. It's amazing how many amazing icon libraries exist. Quite fancy. All right. I don't think is this the right color? I don't know. Wasn't it? Slightly off. All right. We're getting. Perfect. So we have a bunch of our links: home, dashboard, search, notifications, appointments, bookmarks, and settings. Now we're gonna definitely want to spread these out a little bit. I think even though they're at, at about 30, which for following 8 pixels would be 32, I think they're a little bit too squishy at the moment. So I'm gonna maybe bump this up to 40 and see what that looks like, just to give a little bit of breathing room. We're also gonna have some hover effects in the background to highlight as you're hovering over top of them. So we'll definitely want some room for that. And I'm thinking, even though it doesn't look too bad, the text layers are looking a little bit too large, just a little bit, right? So instead of going through and editing each and every one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over to my document assets, make sure that I have our link added as a character style. Now I can go ahead and right click, press edit, and just make any changes necessary. So I can just bring down this as I need to. And you're noticing, because we have these elements inside of a stack, if I make it much smaller or much larger, right, they're moving around as you would expect. Now, obviously that's way too large. Let me edit this one more time, and we'll go down to about 14. It's not bad, but I think some of the icons are misaligned a little bit. I think this one's a little bit too large. Almost got it. Very subtle, but that could work. All right, so we're gonna leave it at that for now. And what we're gonna want to do, let me actually bring this over, considering we're gonna be starting with the expanded view and then working backwards. And then down at the bottom of this navigation bar, we may want maybe 2 additional elements, maybe our profile picture and possibly a name and title. Again, this will change based on what this particular navigation bar is for. But right here at the bottom, I'm going to make sure it's outside of the stack so it doesn't get affected by the elements up above it, right? And I'm going to make sure to, let me actually make sure that this is all lined up properly. Now we probably don't need this profile photo to be this size. It might be a little bit too small. Yeah, it's going to be way too small. So this one, we can definitely break the bounds a little bit and make it a little bit larger like that. And then over to the right, we'll just do something like Howard Pinsky. That is me. Drop that down, and there's my title over there. I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller. And because it's secondary, I might bring this color up a little bit. I think medium I can probably stick to for the weight. I think that might work. And of course we need a photo. Now in this case, I have a photo of me somewhere, but over in my libraries, I do have my Toy Faces library. Oops. Toy Faces. And I do have a Howard Toy Face, which I'm gonna pop that right in there. And let's take a peek. It's looking pretty good. Digging it. All right. Perfect. So now before we move on to creating the actual component, we may want to go ahead and create our active screen, which in this case is going to be home. So it's going to be highlighted with purple. And then we're going to also want to create the, the borders that kind of go, or the hotspot that goes around it as we're hovering. So starting off with home, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the rectangle tool. Again, we want to make sure we're outside of the stack, because if we were inside the stack, we do this, right? Which we definitely don't want. And if we were inside this group, inside of the stack, once we get down to the bottom, because we're going to want a little bit of padding down there, it's going to push the elements down, which we also don't want, because we don't want the links jumping all over the place as we're hovering or changing, you know, the different nested components and so on and so forth. So outside of this stack, we're going to drag this out. I'm going to make sure to place it behind all these other elements except the container in the background. And this one, because it's going to be the active link, right? I'm going to change the fill to a nice bright color, something in this range here, a nice blurple-ish. Blurple's a great word. I'm going to round out the corners a little bit. Now, I know a lot of you are probably screaming already. The contrast is terrible, and it is. It's very bad. So in this case, you know, for the active screens, let me just make sure, put 16, and 16 looks pretty good. Eric says the definitely not Howard doesn't look too far off from today somehow. You know what? You're probably right, Eric. Hold on. Before we get to changing this, totally not Howard. This one over here. Boop. There we go. It's not. I'm going to leave that one. Good call, Eric. All right. So what we're going to want to do is for this one, we're going to dive in here and change it to white. And I might want to make this a little bit thicker and just shift the color a little bit. Something like that. I wonder what 8 will look like. 8 might be too much. Although it's not bad. Not terrible. I would definitely make a few little tweaks to this. Maybe add a little bit more padding on the left, but I don't want to waste too much time, so we may revisit that. And then, like I mentioned, we might want to set up some, you know, hover states that will be nested inside of this particular, you know, navigation bar. So I'm going to duplicate this down. And for this one, I might just drop the opacity to about 16, somewhere in this range here. It'll allow us, we won't need to really change the color of the links because the black on this, you know, very light purple is going to work, which is great. And with this one, we want to create 2 different states, right? So we're going to, the first state is going to be basically invisible, and the next state is going to be our hover state. So I'm going to grab the opacity, now that I kind of know where we're going to settle, drag it all the way down to 0, and I want to create a component of this single element. And some of you might be asking, you know, why don't you just create it with the links? You can, but you know, there are some things you'll have to update. You know, if you want to change the links, you'll have to change it on both components. So there are definitely some pros and definitely some cons, but I like personally just having the hover state separate. It makes it a little bit easier. So Command and Control K to create a component. You can also do that inside of your document assets or within the properties inspector over to the right. And we have our default state looking pretty good, even though we can't see it, right? I'm going to press the plus button over to the right, and I'm going to create a hover state, which is going to be wired up by default, but we are going to change it at some point, and I'll show you why in just a moment. And with the hover state, I'm going to dive in here and just bump the opacity back up to 16. So we have our default state and we have our hover state. And if I go ahead and launch the preview, you're going to notice we have success, right? But there's a bit of a fade, which is going to affect us in a moment. Again, I'm going to get to that in just a second. Now I'm going to switch over to our hover state just so I can see the, or what I can, yeah, I'm going to switch over to the hover state just so I can see it. And this will allow me to create the other ones. And very similar to the links, I'm going to place this hover state into a group, Command and Control G. And I'm going to turn a stack on. And we're going to want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 additional ones. So I'm going to dive in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I want to make sure they're all nicely spaced. Do I need, I needed 6, didn't I? Well done. No. Well done. And this one, I think because I moved the appointments text layer, it shifted just a little bit. So I'm going to just move that manually. That looks pretty good. And I'm going to go through and switch back over to our default state. There. Now, I mentioned earlier that we might have to go back, even though the hover states are wired up by default, we might have to go back and make a small tweak. And that's because, I move this to the middle. If I hover over dashboard, looks fine. But as I hover down, because the hover states have to go in and then out, right? We can't get that nice smooth kind of movement that we probably want in this particular case, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to find our main component, which is this one right here with the solid diamond. We're going to hop into prototype mode. We do have our hover state selected right over here, and I'm going to switch it over from auto animate to transition, right? And then we want to make sure that the animation is set to none. That way the hover state can come and go basically immediately. It doesn't have to wait for any animation or dissolve. And now if I press play one more time, right? Look at that. I can just move up and down much smoother than I could before, which looks great. All right, that's looking pretty good. So we have our active screen and we have our hover effects. And we may want a few additional elements, maybe inside of notifications. Let me bring this over to the right. And maybe in here, we might just want a little bit of a notification badge. Maybe I'll grab the purple. Something like that. And then on the inside, we'll just add a number in there. Probably a bit too. There we go. Might still be a bit, it's not too bad. Probably doesn't fit perfectly, does it? Doesn't. Move that in a little bit. That's a bit better. That'll do. That'll do. All right. So we have notifications looking pretty good. We have our links looking pretty good. I'm going to make sure to group some of these elements. Call this user. We have our links grouped, hovers. We have, what is this? Oh, this was our active. And then we have our container. Perfect. Okay. So I think we're pretty much at a good spot right now where we can now go ahead and create our various states. So we have our expanded state right now, and then we want our collapsed state. And, typically you would probably do it the other way. You would do the collapsed state first, create a hover state, and then expand it all. But because we have everything nicely organized and kind of lined up right now, we can definitely do it backward. It might take one additional step, but that's totally fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure to select all this information, and we're going to create a component. Just like we did before, Command or Control K to create that component. I'm going to name this sidebar. And as a quick side note, because I had components inside of this element, you're going to notice that this one down here was now converted into an instance. Can have main components inside of main components, so it converted it into an instance. So if you do want to edit it, right click and then edit main component. All right, so now that we have our sidebar main component looking pretty good, we obviously want to be able to collapse it, but we also want to be able to hide the elements that will not be seen initially. And to do that, we're going to want to use a layer mask, or an object mask, I should say. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the container down here at the bottom, duplicate it, Command and Control D. I'm going to make sure to move it to the top of all the elements. Now if I were to simply grab this element at the top, select everything below, including the container, and then object mask with shape, it's going to get us what we want, but it's going to cut out that shadow, which we don't want, right? So in that case, I'm going to just exclude the container shape at the bottom. Same thing, mask with shape, or Command and Control Shift and M, boop, and everything looks the same, right? And that's exactly what we want. And what this is going to allow us to do, it's going to allow us to now create our collapsed state on the next state, right? And to do that, we're going to go ahead and select the component. Over to the right, we're going to press that plus button. And typically, because we want a hover state to happen, typically we would select hover state. But we want to start from the collapse state instead. So we're working backwards. So it's going to take that one extra step. So in this case, we're going to create a simple state. Now, if you're not too concerned about the hover effect, and you just want to be able to click on the navigation bar and expand it, then you can do a toggle state straight from here. So you don't need that extra step. But we're going to do a new state. And hopefully it'll make sense in a moment. All right, so with that done, what we want to do is we want to hide all the elements that we don't want seen in the collapsed state. And that all starts with the mask. So inside of this mask group that we created, this object mask group, we're going to select that topmost object, which is the mask that controls what's visible and what's not visible. And we're going to bring this on in, right? Something like that. We want to make sure that the icons are more or less in the center, right? So if we select the icons, about 22 and 26, so we're going to move it outwards about 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I was just holding down my Command and Control key and then using my arrow keys to resize outwards. Now, even though, making that change hit a lot of the objects, we still have a few kind of peeking out. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive in here. One, we're going to move this in as well to match up with our mask. And I'm going to use my guides just to make sure everything lines up really nicely. There we go. And now we can dive into the object mask and start moving some of these elements out. And what I'm thinking is we might want a nice staggered effect as the hover takes place. So instead of just everything kind of coming in equally, we kind of want to make it look like they're kind of like that, right? And to accomplish that, we're going to move these out a little bit. We're going to grab home, move it out a little bit more. Dashboard. Move that out a little bit, right? So I'm kind of staggering. And we've got the badge like that. And sometimes, in order to really see that stagger effect, depending on the components that you're creating, you have to move them out quite a bit further. So this may work, this may not work, we'll see. And then of course, we're going to want our active area to kind of be collapsed a little bit as well. I think that looks pretty good. Almost. And then my little not Howard face, I'm just going to kind of shift over just a touch, just so it lines up in the center. I think that's it. All right, so we now have our collapsed view, which we created second, and then we have our default state, which we created first. Now the big question is, how do we wire this up so that a hover can take place, right? With typical hover states, it just works, right? You don't have to really go into prototype mode unless you want to edit those interactions. But in this case, it doesn't work, right? These ones work, but the entire hover state does not. That's because we worked backwards a little bit. So from the collapse state, which is our second state, we're going to go into prototype mode. We're going to have the entire object selected, and we're going to click on the blue handle to the right. Boop. And then over within the properties inspector, we can choose hover for our trigger. And then we can choose, how we want it to come into play. Because we want to see that kind of staggering effect, we're going to definitely want auto animate. And we don't want it to go too fast, too slow. So we're going to choose our default state, and then let's just try the default options. Ease out with a duration of 0.3 seconds. We'll see what that looks like. Whoop. There we go. That's not too bad, actually. It kind of works. So you can kind of see that staggering effect if you're looking pretty closely. It's very subtle, but it works, right? And we can try something like ease in out, maybe, which also isn't too bad. I don't know. I would probably avoid snap. Although it's not too bad, it's just might be a little bit overdone. And definitely avoid bounce. I don't know if I've ever used bounce in the history of bounce. It's just not a... And you have to keep in mind that when you're working with a hover effect, it's going to reverse. So it's going to use the same easing options on the in and the out. So if you have a bounce, right, it's going to bounce a lot. Don't do bounce. And I think something like ease out should work. There we go. Looking fancy, right? Digging it. Now at this point, everything's set up and looking pretty good. But what we might want is at some point in the future, we may want to add additional links, additional elements, additional something, right? And that you'll definitely want to make sure that you're editing the default state, which is this one right up here of the main component. So if I dive in here, go into my settings, I can duplicate, and maybe this one might be help, for example, and we can change our icon to something like, this one could potentially work. This one's not bad either. Let's try that one there. Oop, wrong document. There we go. Break that down a little bit. Make sure I apply my color. Oh, that's pretty good. And then we're also going to want to make sure that on the hover state, where did it go? Oh, there it is. Perfect. I already did it. Look at that. Isn't that fancy? Oh, settings got moved. There. That's perfect. Perfect. That looks pretty good. All right. So what we're going to do in the last few minutes that we have before we wrap things up, I want to show you how you can adapt something like this for a darker experience. So you might want, a light version and a dark version. So I'm going to duplicate this over. And probably ideally you would have two separate components, but in this case we can definitely, stick with just this one here. And we're going to definitely want to make a few changes. It's not necessarily as simple as changing the background color, right? Which obviously we're going to definitely want to do, right? So if I go ahead and maybe I can use this color here to keep a little bit of consistency. Now, the challenge is we just can't see anything because we have the same color. So I might actually just drop this a little bit just so we can see it for now. And basically anything that is this dark color, we're going to want to shift it to a nice light color. And possibly even, pure white or close to it, right? And I'm going to go through and select all of these links. Now, some of them are bookmark. Some of them are border based, which what we'll probably want to do in that case is dive into the main component and just outline the path, right? So path, outline, stroke. That way it's no longer border based, it's now fill based. So it's very simple to update. And if you want to make it larger or smaller, you won't have any issues with, the path either getting too large or too thin or anything like that, right? Now I should be able to, there we go. Fancy. Now in terms of the purple that we have up here, it's not bad, but when you're working on a dark, it also doesn't line up. Home is just, it bothers me. So the purple's not bad, but when you're working on a darker background, you'll sometimes want to kind of just bring the saturation over a little bit. So suck some of that saturation out, just a touch. So in this case, we're just going to shift it on over just a little bit, just so it's not too saturated, right? So here's the after, and we're mainly looking at the dark version. There's the before. It's a very subtle change, but it can make a world of difference when you're designing for a darker experience, right? Oops, what did I just try to close? Don't do. All right. Someone's saying, I had followed you in your last nav bar. It was amazing, but how to transform it from web builder? Couldn't make it in web. I'm not sure what web builder is. Maybe clarify it. Maybe that's or maybe you're just referring to CSS or HTML or something like that. You can get some HTML and CSS if you publish this as a design spec. So you can get some of that. But for the most part, something like this should be pretty simple to replicate in HTML and CSS. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sample that. That looks pretty good. And then this down here, we're also going to shift that up. And then maybe I'm going to just drop this a little bit. Not too much, but just a little. There we go. So now we have our darker version. Now, of course, we don't have our dark version on the hover state, right? Or the collapse state. So we'll definitely want to go through and make those changes as well, which is why sometimes it's better if you kind of, have two separate components. It makes it a little bit easier, but I'm going to go through and very quickly make these changes one more time. This, and we have basically all of our links. Change that to white. I'm also going to save this particular purple that I have. There we go. And user, make sure to select these. And let's see. All right. That could work. So now we have our two different components. Again, I would probably, make these as separate components just to, keep everything separated because they are very drastic, right? Even though the contents are the same, they're pretty drastic in terms of color differences. And if you really want to go a step further, if you do want to make sure that some of the icons are kept up to date, you can definitely make the icons as components as well. So you have the icon components nested inside of the larger sidebar component. And again, you might have the two separate sidebar components for light and dark, but you can still keep the icons up to date, right? So we have our light version and we have our dark version, and both look pretty fancy, right? Looking pretty good. All right, and for presentation purposes, as you may have seen on my Dribble post or my Behance post, you can definitely duplicate this out and switch it over to we have our light, and we have our dark. And then you can get a little bit fancy by rotating them a little bit. And one trick that I think a lot of people don't really realize that I use all the time is, there may be cases where you might want these elements to be larger. So you can display them, up close, maybe on a bigger artboard or a smaller artboard or whatever it might be. But you're going to notice if I just, resize this. First of all, responsive resize is on. So I'm going to turn responsive resize off on our default states. Right? Switch back over here. Still have it turned on. Why do I have it? Thought I turned it off. It turned it back on. What? I may have found a bug. Anyways, but what you're going to notice is, let me actually just ungroup this for a second. Right? If I turn, okay, I have that turned on. Some things don't scale properly. Sometimes the rounded corners change a little bit, especially if you have border-based icons. They may not resize perfectly, but what you can do is you can actually use 3D transforms to bring some of the object closer. So I'm going to place all of this into a group, Command-Control-G, and then over within the Properties Inspector, I'm going to turn 3D transforms on. And then we want to alter the Z value, which can also be done by pulling on this handle right in the center, right? So in addition to rotating, which is kind of fancy, right? We can also use this handle in the middle to pull back or forward in space. So you can essentially resize your elements without having to worry about any of the objects or styles getting shifted around, right? You don't have to also worry about responsive resize or anything that typically affects resizing. You can just use 3D transforms to bring it forward, and you have this nice, crisp resize, right? Look at that. Fancy. And it still works. Look at that. Your components will still work. Anyways, that's going to wrap things up for me for today. Next week, Masterclass number 100. It's going to be a good time. Definitely follow me on Twitter so you can keep up to date. Follow me on Dribble. I will be releasing, how many have I done so far? 13, I think. So, I don't know math, but there are more to come. More than 13. And stick around. Kyle T. Webster's coming up in just a few moments. Big thank you to everyone who has tuned in, and I'll see you all next time.